evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, and this is your Federal Crime Report, a comprehensive look at major federal prosecutions, sentencings, and investigations unfolding across the northeastern United States during early May of 2026. Tonight's report spans courtrooms from Maine to Delaware, highlighting major narcotic trafficking operations, child exploitation investigations, immigration-related prosecutions, violent crime cases, public corruption, and financial fraud schemes, and organized criminal enterprises that federal authorities say impact communities across the region. We begin in Maine. Federal prosecutors in Bangor say 27-year-old Ibrahim Diabal Khan, a citizen of the United Kingdom, pled guilty to entering the United States without inspection after authorities say he crossed illegally through a heavily wooded terrain near the Canadian border. According to federal records, Khan and three other men allegedly crossed from Quebec into Somerset County during early morning hours of April 3rd, avoiding nearby Staffport and entry in St. Zachary, Maine. Authorities say passerby reported the man walking along the Golden Road before Border Patrol agents located and detained them without incident. Khan now faces up to 6 months in federal prison and $5,000 fine. In another Bangor federal case, 24-year-old Cody Smith of Oakland pled guilty to possession of stolen firearms following the prosecution described as a brazen pawnshop burglary in Waterville. Investigators say Smith broke into the businesses during the early morning hours of August 10, 2025, stealing 23 handguns. Federal authorities say the surveillance system captured the break-in, and within hours, Smith was allegedly posted videos on social media displaying stolen weapons and admitted to burglary. Smith now faces up to 10 years in federal prison. In Portland federal court, 23-year-old Richard Harris of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was sentenced to 32 months in prison for bank fraud and aggravated identity theft. Federal prosecutors say Harris and co-conspirators stole purses, wallets, driver's license, and checkbooks from unattended vehicles across southern Maine. Authorities say the pair forged checks under stolen identities and recruited additional individuals to cash the fraudulent checks at federal credit unions throughout the region. Harris was also ordered to pay more than $31,000 in restitution. A South Portland tax prepper has been sentenced to 2 years in prison after a federal jury convicted him of preparing fraudulent tax returns. 48-year-old Lawrence Okeo was found guilty after prosecutors demonstrated he fabricated deductions and false employment expenses claims to inflate refunds for clients and himself. Federal authorities say Okeo even prepared fraudulent returns for undercover IRS agents, reportedly telling the agents, quote, "I wanted to save you from paying." The fraudulent returns generated inflated returns that prosecutors say taxpayers are not legally entitled to receive. Federal prosecutors say 21-year-old Joar Francisco Brigada Hernandez, a Dominican national, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for possession of fentanyl with an intent to distribute. Authorities say he was a part of Massachusetts to Maine fentanyl trafficking organization operating in the southern Maine. Investigators arrested Brigada Hernandez in Kittery in April of 2024 while allegedly possessing approximately 196 grams of fentanyl. 30-year-old Deshaun Seidminster of Lewiston pled guilty to distributing methamphetamine and heroin. Federal investigators say a confidential FBI source conducted multiple controlled drug purchases from Seidminster beginning in February of 2025. One transaction alleged involved 4 ounces of methamphetamine and 120 grams of heroin. Seidminster now faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years and could receive life imprisonment. Federal authorities also announced the sentencing of Elmer Iker Ramirez Ordon, a Guatemalan national previously removed from the United States in 2014. Border Patrol agents encountered Ramirez Ordon in Franklin County during a roadside immigration inspection near the Canadian border in March of this year. He was sentenced to time served after pleading guilty to illegally re-entering. And finally, in Maine, 24-year-old Austin Cuchararo of Venezia was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for enticing a minor and possessing child pornography. Cuchararo used online payments, applications, and messaging platforms to solicit sexual explicit images from a minor. A federal search warrant later uncovered additional child pornography on devices recovered from his residence. Federal prosecutors in Vermont announced charges against 49-year-old Michael Healy Jr. of Keene, New Hampshire. Authorities say Healy traveled to Brattleboro, Vermont, believing he was meeting a 14-year-old girl for sex after communicating with an undercover law enforcement online. Investigators say Healy agreed to pay $200 and arrive at a hotel carrying cash before agents took him into custody. He has been released on conditions pending trial. 37-year-old William Corey Warner of Rutland was sentenced to 100 months in prison for cocaine and crack trafficking offenses. Federal authorities say Warner fled police in Rutland in 2024, striking a vehicle before abandoning his car. Investigators later discovered cocaine and crack cocaine inside the vehicle. Months later, Warner was arrested again in Massachusetts, where troopers allegedly recovered more than 500 grams of cocaine and a loaded handgun. 26-year-old Noor Mohammed of Burlington received 72 months sentence for illegally possessing a loaded handgun during a chaotic confrontation on Church Street. Authorities say Muhammad allegedly chambered a round during a public fight shortly after area bar closed, causing panic amongst nearby pedestrians. Police say officers struggled for several minutes to subdue Muhammad while an agitated crowd gathered nearby. Federal prosecutors also announced several border-related prosecutions involving foreign nationals accused of unlawfully entering the United States from Canada. Those cases include Cuban national Yasser Rivera Reyes, a Connecticut man accused of fentanyl trafficking, Jaquan Smith, and an Elizabeth, New Jersey resident, Taisha Murray, sentenced to 18 months for transporting Irish national who allegedly crossed illegally into Vermont. Authorities say children transported in Murray's SUV were unrestrained and seated among luggage in the vehicle's cargo area. Federal prosecutors in Vermont also announced major developments in international fraud investigations involving a nationwide grandparent scam. 7 additional Canadian nationals were arrested in Canada following a Homeland Security Task Force investigation in a multi-million-dollar scheme targeting elderly Americans. Authorities say the operation used call centers in Quebec to convince elderly victims that relatives had been arrested and urgently needed to pay bail money. Federal prosecutors allege the conspiracy victimized elderly individuals across more than 40 states. Federal prosecutors in New Hampshire announced charges against 35-year-old Dean DeCherry of Nashua, an employee of the Federal Aviation Administration. Authorities allege DeCherry used his government computer to conduct distributing searches involving presidential assassinations and methods of bringing firearms into federal facilities. Prosecutors further allege that he later emailed directly threats to President Donald Trump through the White House public contact system. If convicted, DiCiarelli faces up to 5 years in prison. A federal grand jury also indicted 26-year-old Blue Ziki Zaley for the attempted murder of a federal officer. Authorities say the Border Patrol agent encountered Daley near the Canadian border in February before Daley allegedly opened fire on the agent near the Pittsburgh port entry. The agent returned fire, wounding Daley. Federal prosecutors say Daley remained under guard following the shooting. Moving to Rhode Island, in New Providence, former Santa Barbara Bank employee Carlos Braze pled guilty to mail fraud and aggravated identity theft after prosecutors accused him of stealing more than $125,000 from a 78-year-old customer suffering from dementia. Authorities say Braze secretly enabled online banking access, ordered checks to addresses he controlled, and transferred money overseas to Portugal. Federal prosecutors also charged 58-year-old Felipe Amanto Polanco with wire fraud and identity theft in connection with the alleged SNAP benefit fraud scheme. Investigators say Polanco used the identities of deceased individuals and others to fraudulently obtain approximately $69,000 in food assistance benefits. 51-year-old Jerry Lee Davenport was sentenced to 10 years in prison after federal agents discovered multiple storage devices containing child sexual abuse material inside his residence. Authorities say the investigation began after Homeland Security investigation received cyber tips involving illegal material. Federal authorities in Connecticut announced multiple sentencing and indictments tied to major narcotic trafficking organizations operating in New Britain car dealership known as Supreme Automotive. 37-year-old Jose Rivera was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison after investigators seized fentanyl, cocaine, cash, and firearms from his residence. Federal prosecutors say the broader investigation resulted in seizures of more than 5 kilograms of cocaine, hundreds of grams of fentanyl and heroin, 7 firearms, 26 vehicles, and approximately $75,000 in cash. 25-year-old Tulio Nunes of the Bronx pled guilty after investigators say he participated in stealing mail from a postal collection box in New Haven using a counterfeit postal arrow key. Authorities say Nunes attempted to flee law enforcement by reversing his vehicle into a police cruiser before being apprehended. 28-year-old Ramon Perez received 2 years in federal prison sentence after police discovered a loaded handgun and marijuana package for sale during a traffic stop. Federal prosecutors say Pierre has prior convictions involving firearms and assault on a police officer. Federal prosecutors also unsealed charges against Kenny Laporte of Hartford. Authorities allege Laporte distributed large quantities of fentanyl and stored narcotics and firearms at a Hartford residence. Investigators recovered approximately 1.7 kilograms of fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, 9 firearms, cash, and ammunition. Laporte faces a mandatory minimum of 10 years and could receive life imprisonment. Federal prosecutors across New York announced several disturbing child exploitation cases. In Syracuse, previously convicted sex offender Alden Fuller was charged after investigators alleged discovered a large volume of child pornography involving children as young as 6 years old. Jeremy Sauter of Congo County pled guilty to attempting to coerce and entice a minor while already on post-release supervision for a prior child sex offender conviction. And in Rochester, Geneva resident Rafael Arua Abules was charged after investigators allege uncovered videos depicting sexual abuse of a 5-year-old girl during a narcotics investigation. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentence of Justin McDowell of North Carolina for unlawfully dealing firearms. Authorities say McDowell transported weapons, including illegal firearm switches, from North Carolina into Albany for resale. A Venezuelan national was sentenced after admitting involvement of an ATM jackpot scheme spanning from New York, Massachusetts, and Illinois. Federal investigators say David Jose Gamaz Circa and co-conspirators used malware-infected hard drives to force ATMs to dispense cash. Authorities estimated the theft totaled nearly $300,000 in cash. Federal prosecutors also announced Edgar Sanchez Solis pled guilty in connection with a major international alien smuggling organization operating along the northern border of Canada. Authorities say the organization smuggled hundreds of migrants from Mexico, Central America, and South America into the United States for profit. Moving to Pennsylvania, federal prosecutors in Philadelphia announced guilty pleas from 4 defendants, including 2 former U.S. Postal Service employees, accused of participating in conspiracy involving stolen Treasury checks worth more than $84 million. Authorities say thousands of checks were stolen directly from USPS mail sorting machine and later resold nationwide throughout the messaging application Telegram. Investigators estimate approximately $11 million in stolen checks were successfully cashed. Jonathan Lim of Wallingford, Pennsylvania, was sentenced to 18 months in prison after admitting he stole nearly $214,000 from an ATM at the bank branch where he worked. Federal prosecutors say Lim concealed the theft by falsifying bank records before spending much of the stolen money gambling. Federal prosecutors in Pennsylvania also announced child pornography charges against Andrew Murphy of Nanticoke, illegal re-entry charges against a Mexican national, Victorino Cruz Lopez, an Italian national, Luigi Espirito, and a Salvadorian national, Jose Antonio Terraza Marquez. In New Jersey, federal prosecutors in Newark announced charges against IRS revenue agent Robert McClowey of Clarkstown, New Jersey. Authorities accuse McClowey of embezzling more than $12 million while serving as a CFO and controller of New Jersey Fuel Company. Investigators allege McClowey funneled company funds into personal accounts, spent substantially amount gambling through the online sports books and casinos. 41-year-old Thomas Kane Miller of Somerset pled guilty to distributing fentanyl and heroin that resulted in a fatal overdose. Federal authorities say Miller admitted to distributing narcotics to victims who later died in Somerset County in 2022. Federal prosecutors say Mark Kazavatsky and co-conspirators stole millions from struggling small businesses during the COVID era by promising fraudulent debt relief services. Authorities say the victims believed their payments would be used to negotiate settlements with creditors. Instead, investors allege the money was diverted to personal use, including gambling expenses exceeding $1 million. And in one of the region's largest white-collar prosecutions, former healthcare executive Pranjit Paul Palmer was sentenced to 5 years in prison for participating in a $212 million security fraud conspiracy. Federal prosecutors say Palmer and co-conspirators fabricated revenues, falsified bank records, and received investors regarding the value of the healthcare service company. Authorities say the scheme ultimately contributed to the company's collapse and bankruptcy. Federal prosecutors in Delaware announced that 22-year-old Miles Clark pled guilty to transporting 12-year-old girl across state lines for criminal sexual activity. Authorities say Clark met the victim through Snapchat before transporting her from Pennsylvania to Delaware. Clark faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison and could receive life imprisonment. Federal prosecutors throughout the Northeast continue to prioritize violent crimes, narcotic trafficking, child exploitation, organized fraud, and immigration related offenses as federal agencies expand multi state international investigations. Many of the defendants featured in tonight's report remain presumed innocent unless proven guilty in the court of law. For continued coverage of federal criminal investigations, organized crimes, public corruption, and major court developments across the United States, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Good night.